Welcome to the Radio Worldview Podcast. I'm August Huckabee. The Radio Worldview Podcast exists to teach students to live and think with a biblical worldview so that they can serve Christ and lead the culture. Tune in every week for perspectives on the arts, current events, and how to apply a biblical worldview to every aspect of reality. Thanks so much for joining us. Hope you enjoy the show. Well, welcome back on the podcast, Micah.
Thanks.
Good to have you again.
Happy to be here.
This is like third or fourth time for you, something like that.
Yeah, I've been here enough. I thought I'd go casual today.
Yeah,
just
I know.
really relax and make the
feeling really
space
at
my
home.
own.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, it is fitting, obviously, because we're going to be talking about Batman today. Batman came out recently in theaters.
Yes,
and
it did.
So you and I went and saw it.
Yes, we did.
And then, how many times have you seen it now?
I've seen it twice.
Okay.
I went back because just in the, we'll talk about it as we go, but even leaving the theater, I felt like the first time that you and I watched it, there was maybe a little bit of uncertainty of like, okay, how are we going to unpack this? What are some of the things we're going to talk about? Anyway, so I thought it would be wise to see it again before we podcasted. And then also, it's Batman. And so
why not see it twice?
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. So we're going to talk through kind of three things today. We're going to cover some of the general stuff with the movie and kind of how it compares to previous Batman series. And then we'll talk about the nature of corruption that kind of came out in the film. Sure. And then the nature of, what is it?
Heroism.
Heroism. There you go. Nature of heroism. So we'll cover those kind of our segments today. So let's talk about general stuff for the movie. What would you think?
Oh man, really good, really good.
Let's just preface this by saying you're a pretty huge DC fan.
I am a big comics fan. I do not buy into the false dichotomy that you have to somehow choose Marvel or DC.
Gotcha.
And forswear and reject the other side of the argument. I don't buy into that. I am, however, a huge Batman fan, particularly. Batman is what got me into comics. He's the character that, if you look at my collection, dominates it in terms of what I've read. And I've always just really appreciated the character, even going back to before I was in comics, when I was growing up watching Batman animated series and stuff like that. Just really enjoy the character, think he's really, really cool, and appreciate most of his movies. I'll say it that way. This one's really good. My question is personally, where does it kind of rack and stack with the other Batman movies that I've seen and consumed? And I would say it's like everything that I've watched and consumed, it's probably top third easily. And I can pretty safely say it's probably not the best Batman movie I've ever seen. The two contenders for that are still The Dark Knight and The Mask of the Phantasm, which probably most people haven't ever heard of.
No.
But it's an animated version of it's coming out of the Batman the Animated series. They made a couple of like feature-length movies in that universe.
In the animated series.
And that movie is so good.
Really?
Yes.
I had no idea.
Oh
I have
man,
not
it's
ever heard
so
of that.
good. Anyway, but the it's up there, so it's really good, and I would encourage people that are interested in comic book movies or interested in Batman to go see it. You'll enjoy yourself. As far as like a couple of kind of unique things that are going on in this movie, it wisely, and a lot of people have said this, but I think it wisely buys into the idea that Batman's story, like the broad strokes of it.
I'm really thankful they did that.
Yeah, like who Batman is, and so what it does is it cuts to, or it allows them to jump into a context for Batman where he's early in his crime fighting career. He's still a young man. He's still learning and figuring out a lot of things about what he's doing should look like and what it means, and still unpacking and learning a lot of that information. But you also don't have to see Martha and Thomas Kent being murdered and the pearls falling in the rain, and then Batman going on his training montage. And so in some ways, like, we've seen all that before and we don't need to see it again, but also it saves time in the movie. You get to invest that time in other ways to make the mystery more compelling or more interesting.
Yeah, well, in my mind too, I think a lot of people in our generation would say the Christopher Nolan Batman movies are just almost untouchable in terms of their quality. And I know you would argue with that, and that's fine.
Sure.
But I would just say, I think that the movie does it almost pays respect to that in saying, look, we don't need to tell the story again.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, it takes for granted, one, that you know it, and two, that the story has been told well enough that we don't need to laboriously go through this again.
Right.
Just very quickly as an aside, to throw rocks at another movie, but when Batman vs Superman came out a few years ago, and the movie starts off, I went and saw it by myself the first time I did.
And you did? I didn't know that.
Yeah, and then later saw it, or I don't know. Maybe
I thought we saw it together.
I don't recall. I know that I've seen it. I know I saw it at least twice. One without Jeff Baldwin and one with Jeff Baldwin. And the first time I saw it was without Jeff Baldwin. And when the movie starts and the title credits are just over the scenes and the shots of the Waynes being murdered again, I immediately kind of sunk in my chair. And my first reaction was, "Man, are we doing this again? Really?" And then second reaction is, Jeff's just going to start cracking up as soon as this movie starts.
Yep.
But we don't have to dwell on that. He's not here, and if he wants to talk about Batman, he can take time on his own podcast to do it.
Sure.
But as far as like things within the movie that I thought were interesting, again, this newness context of who he is and what he's trying to do, it even goes down to the Batmobile. Like the Batmobile, which number one looks super cool. I love the approach that they took with the kind of going back to the muscle car route, rather than the kind of combat vehicle tank, as cool as the Tumbler was in the Christopher Nolan movies.
Right.
But it like looks half built, right? Like there's several shots throughout the movie where you get it on. It's on a rack where he's working on it,
covered up.
And you see parts all around, and you see clear evidence that he's working on this vehicle. And then when it gets introduced, first of all, it's a really sweet introduction. The way that they decide to do it. It looks like a monster coming out of the shadows, and then two, it just looks half built, and so it leans into this. He's still new. He's still figuring out. Even the art design that they did with the suit, making it the way that it looks, it kind of looks like it's like, I need this piece of equipment, and I need a way to carry it, and this is the most functional, immediately available pouch that I can make this happen. It doesn't look really sleek or super well defined yet, in the same way that the character's not. And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about later in terms of the ideas, is that he's still learning how to be Batman and what Batman needs to mean to accomplish what he's actually trying to do.
Yeah, I didn't really pick up on that until we kind of started talking about it, but I think you're totally right in that there's kind of this it almost seems like it's a youthful idealism kind of early on, right? And it's kind of he's throwing everything of himself at this problem, and then because of some like predetermined ideals of like his parents were good people, and he's trying to kind of work out justice through against the city because of their death, and it's like very idealistic. And as the movie progresses, should we say there's going to be spoilers in this?
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's going to be spoilers in this, so just so you know. But as the movie progresses, it just shows up like, oh, there was corruption in your past, and that just reminded me of like my 20s, honestly, like kind of coming through them and starting very idealistic and just kind of throwing myself into my work, and then eventually coming to the spot of like, oh, things are not as ideal as I thought they were when I was 21 or 22. There's like more functional ways that things happen, and they're not always just, and you have to like deal with that.
Yeah, and there's a maturing process that goes on where youthful idealism, to borrow your word, or youthful passion confronts reality as it is.
Right.
And the way that those two things collide and influence each other, I don't think it's unfair to suggest that it's probably part of most of our stories, that in some way there's a part of us that is passionate about something or excited about something and eager to get involved, and then the more reality interacts with that passion or that idealism, it demands some level of change or adjustment, or at least reconsideration and reevaluation to take place. And that doesn't mean that our passion goes away. That doesn't mean that our idealism dies.
Right. But
it is confronted with information that it wasn't previously aware of.
Yeah, and I think you do see that between Batman and Catwoman in this movie, where it seems like Catwoman has kind of moved to this place of almost like nihilism, like, well, nothing really matters other than kind of vengeance, right? And other than that, it's just kind of get what you can. Whereas we'll talk about this later maybe, but at the end at the end of the movie, she kind of offers that to him as a way out, and he just kind of says like, no, I'm not going to do that. Like I will, like, this may not be what I thought it was, but I'm going to stay here.
Yeah. The fight might not be what I thought it was when I signed up for it, but the fight is still worth having and it's still worth pursuing. Yeah. And we'll definitely come back to that because that's kind of a critical point of the movie in terms of what one of the future questions of the nature of corruption that we're going to get to.
Yeah.
But
any other big thoughts on like kind of general stuff?
General stuff really quickly. Really liked what they did with all of the villains or all of the other like secondary characters. Really like James Gordon. Really like how he is very clearly positioned as not entirely, but kind of a man alone within the police force, at least the senior leadership of the police force, that he's this kind of outcast and outsider on his own right within the GCPD. Really liked Catwoman, thought she was pretty compelling as a character, and the tension between the flirtatious relationship that she and Batman has, and then also the conflicting ideals that they are bringing to the table is a very common theme throughout the comic books, that they both have this mutual attraction to each other, but they both recognize that they see the world differently.
Right.
And there's consequences for that. Really like, as far as like kind of the villains are concerned, really like Penguin. I thought he was hilarious at appropriate times, and then also really compelling just as a visual embodiment of what that character would be, which is, I mean, a lot of Batman's villains outside the context of a comic book page or outside the context of an animated series or presentation of them can easily turn into caricatures and just be silly.
Right.
He's the Penguin, but he's not silly. And in the same way, the Riddler is the Riddler, but he's not silly.
Right.
And they found a way to portray those villains in really interesting and compelling ways for their story that don't take you out of the gravity of the story. One of the things that we don't have to go down that road, but the I really like what they did with all the side characters. And the last thing I'll say about general kind of overview stuff is really good score, really good music choices.
Yeah, really good music.
You and I were talking even during the movie and after about Batman's theme and like just the heavy brass sounds that are always accompanied with it. And the things that immediately struck me with it is whenever that theme comes on screen, it made me think of Darth Vader's Star Wars theme, which is kind of an odd connection as far as like those two characters being paired together, but it's the musical tension of creating that sense of doom and sense of the sense of doom that's approaching onto the villains. And so it's like when Oswald Cobblepot, when Penguin is upside down in his car watching Batman slowly walk to him, and this brrr,
you know it's like about to happen.
It's like you that's a tool the filmmaker is using to help each other. It's like he's kind of terrified out of his mind right now, like he's supposed to be scared. Anyway, that was all really good. And then the other thing that, especially seeing it on second viewing, as far as music is concerned, is Ave Maria appears several times over the course of the movie, and I'm not classically musically inclined enough to like really appreciate that, other than it's sticking out to me. And so I had to do like a little bit of research, and the connection point is that it's often like a funeral dirge or like sung at funerals or when somebody has died, and it just has this very, when you knowing that and then looking back at the movie, it's like, oh, light bulb. Like the death is very much attached to each one of those moments, and foreshadowing it when it does come on screen or when you hear it.
Cool. I hadn't put that together.
Yeah. So anyway, nothing in movies are accidental.
Definitely.
Might be unintentional in terms of their impact or consequence, but nothing is accidentally on screen or accidentally a part of the experience. And so filmmakers are good at what they do.
I really loved how, just since we're talking about some general stuff, I really loved how it felt like a mystery story. You know, man. It just like it struck me as being kind of like Knives Out or something like that, where it's like from the very beginning, you know, like this is a mystery film. And you have Batman who's kind of going through all this stuff, but it's not about it's not really about like Batman's story as much as like you're really engrossed in like what's going on, and I felt like my brain was just so tied into trying to figure out the next steps of the story with what's going to happen next and who it is.
Yeah, and this is going back a brief moment to something we've kind of already touched on, but the filmmakers are taking advantage of the fact that we know who Batman is.
Yeah.
We know who Batman is,
Right.
and we know his story, and we can launch into exactly what you're talking about. We don't have to spend a whole bunch of time introducing Bruce or Alfred
Right.
or Gordon or anybody. We know who these characters are, and we can just, this is the mystery.
Yeah.
This is what's going on in Gotham this week.
Yep.
And I can't tell you how long I've been waiting for a live action Batman movie that is primarily a mystery to be shown to me and well executed, or at least reasonably well executed, and this movie does nail that.
Yeah,
and so
totally.
fist pumping for that, at least element of it coming out of the theater.
Yeah, so let's switch to the second segment where
Sure.
we talk about the nature of corruption. I mean, that's basically what this whole story was about. Like, the Riddler kind of sees some of the things that are going on that are corrupt within the city and starts to target these individuals who have been involved in corrupt activities. And, so we'll kind of kick off there.
Yeah, so by way of, again, spoilers, but just to set the stage so this conversation makes sense if any of it wasn't comprehensible the first time you watched it, the Riddler discovers that this initiative started by Thomas and Martha Wayne, this charitable initiative for the sake of the city of Gotham, has been overtaken and basically pillaged and looted for just personal gain by a whole bunch of mobsters and their political cronies, political and police cronies. And so Riddler discovers this, and he is a individual who has been disadvantaged all of his life and brought up in an orphanage, and so he
becomes a forensic accountant, right? So he has the ability to track this stuff down,
all the money that's moved around, and so he has been sold a bill of goods as far as the promises of this charitable foundation, and then when it didn't show up, why did this happen to me? Why has this occurred? And he finds the reason, and so he starts taking out these people that he holds responsible for this. And before we started, I brought this point up, but one of the things that I find interesting in media and art that comes out of like liberal dominated, or maybe a better way of saying it is progressive dominated sources like Hollywood is that there's often a tension between what they say they want their message to be and what the message they convey actually becomes. Yeah. And by that, I mean, in Batman, there's a lot of language about systemic problems. There's a lot of language that comes up, kind of recurring, about the system and problems with the system.
I wouldn't say a lot, but I would say it's
maybe
there.
Not a lot, but
it didn't feel shoved down my throat, but it did feel like
it's there. It's there,
present.
and there are even times. There's one particular moment where Catwoman literally says, "Nobody cares about anybody but these white privileged people." Yeah, that have been killed, and like so the. You're right, and that is a fair point to make. That it's not some like, we're going to crush you with this progressive agenda kind of approach. It doesn't feel that way, but it's there enough to be purposeful in terms of the language that they use and the dialogue that they use. Yeah. But what they show is not systemic corruption. Right. What they show is the consequences and decisions of a couple key individuals that made choices and made bad choices, and then bad consequences flow out to other people. Yeah. And I look at that as a Christian and I say, yeah, Carmine Falcone is an evil man who's made evil decisions, and those decisions have consequences. And part of the tragedy of the fall, part of the tragedy of our sinful condition is that I'm not the only one who reaps bad consequences for my evil decisions oftentimes, and that the bad decisions, bad consequences that I have, in a sense, kind of brought into reality by my choices, they have the possibility to touch Huck in really negative, problematic ways. They have the opportunity to touch other people in my life in really problematic and bad ways. And that's the biblical vision of corruption. That's the biblical understanding of the sinfulness of man. And so what Batman tells you is one thing versus what it shows you is actually a much more biblically based vision of they made evil decisions that had these consequences and had all of this negative fallout. And so ultimately the corruption that is being fought back against is not some systemic thing like the critical theorists and our current progressive observers
kind
of
of
society want to describe and talk about, that everything is outside of man. We have racism without racists, and things like that. That it's all outside of us and it's all system based, and it wants to at times pay lip service to that vision of reality, while the rest of the movie shows this far more concrete, far more biblically coherent vision of bad people making bad choices and having and developing bad consequences in their immediate sphere of influence. And we said earlier that nothing is accidental in movies, and I do stand by that, but I think that there's, whether it's consciously observed or realized or not, there's a reason that inconsistency takes place.
Well, I was going to ask you that, right? Because I think in the Marvel movies too, there's just some of that happens where it's like there's some kind of progressive narrative that happens every now and then, but then it just seems like the story as a whole tends to go towards some more biblical based values.
And the reason that's the case is because the stories that we resonate with are the stories that actually resonate with reality in some fundamental way as far as the ideas that they're talking about. And it's really hard to tell a story where the system is a villain and have me care about it,
right?
Even without my biases and my own the perspective that I'm coming from as a believer. The system is the villain. Well, I don't like, how does Batman go punch the system, right? How does Batman have a conversation with the system and make that a compelling thing? It's like if everything is basically what it boils down to, if everything is beyond the scope of human action and human agency as far as kind of the source of our problems, that's not a compelling story that we want to go watch.
Well, I think too, though, I think you maybe mentioned this, but the Riddler kind of tries to attack the system, right? And so you kind of say like, well, hey, Batman can't go punch the system, but like the Riddler kind of tried to. And it was just interesting because it was his... he was the villain, right? And it was his acts of saying, like, no, we're going to invite chaos, we're going to invite anarchy, we're going to invite...
we're going to burn the whole thing to the ground.
We're going to burn the whole thing down. We're going to punish society, essentially, as being the suppressed group, which, to be fair, he was like a white male, but at the same time, he was a marginalized person, right? He was in poverty, and he was a marginalized person, and he said, we're going to punish the system, and it was that was fought back against.
Right, exactly. Like the again, spoilers, but at the end of the movie, Riddler sets off a series of explosions that damage a seawall that protects Gotham from the harbor, and basically floods the entire city, massively floods the entire city. Presumably thousands of people are killed in this act because it happens so quickly and so
then
fast.
Tries to facilitate a mass shooting
through
that.
Specifically to target the incoming government officials that, like, the whole story takes place in the context of the last week of a mayoral campaign. And so you have this power transition, and he targets this power transition as another way of doing this broad, sweeping, overarching, system-wide reset for Gotham City in a way that he thinks is more just and more appropriate and would be better for the people like him that are finding themselves in this disadvantaged situation. And of course, it's a movie, and so it's like it's taking the metaphor and actually putting it on screen in action for us. But like that's the language coming from the progressive side that rejects
especially the extreme progressive side
that rejects, more importantly, progressive or not, like the side that is rejecting the biblical understanding of human corruption. That's their answer. Burn everything to the ground, restart, we can do better, and when we do that, we're going to essentially fix this corruption issue that we're all dissatisfied with. That's our solution. We got to burn it down, restart, or in the case of this movie, wash it away and restart. And those actions and those words are put in the mouth of the villain in this movie, and that's not insubstantial.
Right.
And the fact that the hero, the guy we're cheering for, is fighting against that, resisting that, trying to overcome it, and trying to work through it. Again, it's that tension between the sensibilities that the movie at times says it wants you to buy into, and versus what they're actually showing you on screen to make a good story.
And I think, like, kind of on that note, I wonder if in the last couple years, since the BLM riots and some of that stuff that was kind of around this narrative, I wonder if that Hollywood or whoever the writer was for this kind of got wise to that and just kind of said, like, hey, we understand there needs to be some justice here, but anarchy's not the answer, right? Because here's why. I mean, like last week, Joe Biden, right, says instead of defund the police, like he literally says we need to fund the police. And like the Democratic Party just did a total 180 on that whole narrative, which is just wild to me.
Some of them did,
Yeah, right, yeah. Some of them lost their minds over it. But there's like a total 180 on that idea, and I think people just realize, like, oh yeah, like defunding the people who are supposed to help enforce justice in the world around us is not the way to go.
Maybe not a great idea. Maybe, just maybe.
Yeah.
But the thing in talking about the recent Biden comments from the State of the Union, and then also reaching back into Black Lives Matter, and I would even lump like Antifa's actions and stuff like that.
Sure.
Like, it's one thing to sit in a comfortable coffee shop or ivory tower and like talk about revolution. Like, I mean, they're talking, coming out of the French Revolution, and prior to it, like there's this whole professional revolutionary class. It's one thing to talk about that, and it's another thing to actually see it happening. It's another thing to actually see cities burning down and people having their livelihood destroyed in front of them. And now if you buy into those ideas, now you're in the position where you have to stand in front of a news camera and a mic and say basically something to the effect of, well, that's terrible for them, but it was worth it in the long run, or they had it coming, or this is what justice looks like. To actually see it happening and actually see it made real in reality, when those ideas actually have consequences,
right.
Like, get that away from me.
Yeah.
The natural, very understandable human reaction to that, unless you've drank the Kool-Aid, I'll say it that way, of the idea itself. If you're on the fence or non-committed or maybe ignorant of the conversation beforehand, and you haven't bought in personally to the ideology that's on display, almost universally you're going to reject that, because you're going to, God's image in us, the image-bearing nature that we have, is going to look at that. Unless it's been so poisoned, I would argue it's going to see that as, get away from me, reject that.
Right. We could go a long time on that. I think, I think there's even things to be said for just like the escalating nature of violence in our country up until basically the January 6th riots. And then everybody was like, whoa, everybody calm down. Because like it was finally in their, like in politicians' front yard. And I think that made a pretty big difference for them. So let's kind of transition into the nature of heroism real quick.
Sure.
If that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's kind of get going on that topic.
Sure. As we said earlier, in kind of the context setting, just talking about the broad strokes of the movie, Batman, Bruce Wayne, is at the earlier portions of his career in this movie, and it's over the film, you pretty clearly get the sense of like he's still learning how to do this. There's still elements of it that are elusive to him in terms of the right way to approach it and how he should be going about the business of being this kind of avenging angel almost in Gotham, and what that should actually look like. And one of the things that the first time we see Batman in the suit, when he walks out into what is a subway terminal or whatever, and he beats up this horde of thugs, which is really, really cool, but he saves a guy that they're attacking. And when he does that, he introduces himself. He literally, he doesn't say I'm Batman or I'm the Batman. He introduces himself as Vengeance. I'm Vengeance.
Right.
And over the course of the movie, at least two other characters call him that.
Right.
In kind of jest. Catwoman calls him it at least at one point, and so does Penguin. And the point being that he's probably introduced himself in this way to other people. Like this is how he presents himself and communicates who the Batman is to the criminal underworld that he is pursuing and trying to restrain in some ways. And what is telling about that first moment that Batman comes on screen, actually walks out in the suit, and we see him, is once he's dealt with the thugs, the innocent
the guy
man,
he saves,
the man he saves, looks up at him, and his first reaction is not, "Oh, thank you so much," like, "You saved me." Like that's not his first reaction. The words that come out of his mouth are, "Please don't hurt me."
Yeah.
And so he's looking at Batman as yet an additional, now greater threat to him.
Yeah.
Which
is the reaction, by the way, of all biblical characters to angels, right?
That's
like, please don't hurt me.
Yeah, that's true. Like, don't kill me. But
yeah, I'm sure that was intentional in some way. I don't know. You got to think there's some intentionality to it. I don't think they're trying to make it a biblical, like, parallel, but I do think there's like something to that.
I mean, I think that there's something to. I mean, when we encounter when we encounter the raw force of justice, that should be terrifying.
Right.
There should be an element of that is terrifying to us. And so when we talked earlier about the score and talked about how Batman's theme has this like massively almost overpowering like sense of doom that it's trying to create in you to feel on behalf of the villain, like it should be terrifying when justice is coming after us.
Yeah.
When justice is chasing me down, that should be the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced.
Yeah.
When the just consequences of my evil actions are being unambiguously brought to my attention and brought to bear in my life. Fear is an entirely appropriate response to that.
Yeah.
And what Bruce Wayne learns over the course of the movie is that that's not the entire picture of justice, however. That's not the total picture of what justice should be doing. And what it made, reflecting on it after seeing the movie a couple times, it made me think of the passage from Romans 13. I'm just going to read it very briefly as far as unpacking this idea a little bit further. But starting in verse 3 of Romans 13, "For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do what is wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer." Now, Paul is very concretely talking about the role of government and the role of law in the society.
Yeah.
But the theme that he's unpacking or touching on, I think, is at least in part how we as individual people can and should relate to the idea of justice and its application. And if you've done evil, justice should terrify you.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if you have done good, if you are innocent, if you have done what is right and what is called of you, then justice should in fact be a comfort to you. It should be a good that protects you and serves you. And so what Batman learns over the course of this movie is that heroism in the service of justice requires more than just being this dark, overwhelming, avenging angel that beats the crud out of evildoers. Like he needs to be more than that if he's going to have the effect that he's trying to have in the city of Gotham towards this positive thing.
Where do you feel like you saw that in the movie?
So there's a couple of points. First, at the very beginning of the movie, very, very early on, you get this pretty extended monologue where Batman is... We have the access to his inner thoughts as he's journaling in his kind of after-action reports.
Right.
And one of the things that he says is that he's been doing this for 2 years, and crime has actually gone up. All these violent actions have actually gone up and gotten worse since he's been activating as Batman, and he's not seeing the fruit of his actions that he was anticipating. The bigger one, the kind of more in-your-face obvious one, is that when Batman and Riddler finally come face-to-face after Riddler's been arrested and captured, they have an opportunity for a conversation, and Riddler looks in Batman's eyes and says, like, you inspired me to do this. Yeah. Riddler is expecting to see and be received by Batman as a kindred spirit who is enacting vengeance and going no holds barred against what the corruption that he's perceived and discovered. And Batman is repulsed by this. He's repulsed by what the Riddler has done up to this point.
Right.
And he is repulsed by this idea that somehow he has inspired the Riddler to do what he's done. Yep. And the words, and I might not get the quote exactly right, but the words that the Riddler says is, "You showed me what could be done with fear and a little bit of focused violence." Mm-hmm. And if that's all what justice is, if that's the only part of what justice looks like, then you do risk this kind of response in terms of people seeing that part of justice and wanting to lean into it without seeing the full biblical picture of what it looks like in the hands of God and the way that he uses it in reality.
Yeah.
And then the last like kind of turning point moment is at the end of the movie when Batman is assisting in these rescue efforts that are going on after this flood has happened. First of all, it's the only time we see Batman during the day.
Yeah.
And he's in the light.
I think, or really in public, like in a
like a very obvious circumstance where it's not just him and these isolated bad guys that he's beating up. Right. But no, he's in the light. He hasn't taken his mask off, obviously, but he's letting himself be seen in the daylight by public crowds, and he's not beating up people. He's helping the people that need help in a situation where they have been targeted by this massive act of injustice in terms of trying to kill all of them, and he's assisting with these rescue efforts. And what Bruce Wayne learns by the end of the movie, and again we kind of have access to his inner thoughts by the end of it, he has to be both. There has to be a way for him to be both, and that's kind of the next step in his maturing of him being a crime fighter, that he is going to need to figure out how he does it, how he embraces that, of being both the terror to evildoers and then also the source of encouragement to the rest of the general population of Gotham City that serves as something to look at and aspire to, or look at and say, this can be done better, this needs to be done better, and things like that.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. It's a really good point that heroism is not just about the infliction of the sword, but also it's about the pursuit of like mercy and kindness and things of that nature.
Yeah, and
caring about your community.
And especially the context of Batman as a comic book hero who's like a crime fighter, that heroism is inseparable from the kind of broader sense of justice that Batman is pursuing and helping to support.
Yeah.
One of the things, this is a really minor point, but one of the things that I really liked about this movie, and probably is not going to be noticed by many people, but the way that I've described Batman in the past is that he's an interferer. His purpose is to interfere with evildoers as they're trying to do evil.
Yeah.
He's not an executioner. Like, everybody wants to run and ask questions like, why doesn't he just kill Joker? It's like, because that would be unjust of him to do, and he serves justice. Right. But the thing that the point that makes in terms of connecting the dots to this movie is the kind of big bad guy of all this corruption, the mobster at the end of it, Carmine Falcone. Batman goes and he captures him and he drags him out, and then as soon as he gets him outside of this club, this building, he immediately turns him over to the police. The police are right there, and he's just like, "Here you go. Like, this is the guy you were looking for. This is who we've been searching after. I as Batman, who is not an official arm of justice, if you will, I'm an interferer. I am now turning him over to justice in the appropriate sense of the, frankly, biblical model of this is the arm of the state. This is the person that God has given the authority to do justice to. I'm immediately turning them over to him. He's their responsibility, and my role has ended because I have I'm done interfering with the evil that he was attempting to do in that moment.
Right. Right. Which is fascinating because he does, earlier in the movie, like right before that, he stops Catwoman from killing Falcone and kind of has that discussion of like this is not our role. Like this is, if you decide to take on the role of a killer, then you're just like them and you're not any better. Yeah,
and you can't come back from it, all that conversation. But it was, anyway, like it's a common, and maybe some of our listeners have had that question of like, well, why doesn't he just kill these people? Like, why doesn't he just get rid of the Joker? Would that be so bad when he's a mass murderer and all this stuff? It's like, yeah, it would, and he knows it, and that's part of what makes him heroic, is that he's willing to lean into these fights, if you will, and continue to be willing to interfere with evil when it's attempting to be evil, and yet not go beyond his limitations of his limited role. And the kind of initial parallel that I would make for the real world is that if I was walking down the street in New York City and I look down an alley and I see that there's a mugging taking place, like, I hope that I would be brave enough, and I believe that I have a moral duty and obligation. It's like, I need to go help that person.
Yeah.
I need to go try and stop that situation and help that person if I'm aware of it and can.
Yep.
And so, like, that's incumbent on me to do now that I've been placed in those circumstances. It's not my job to take a baseball bat and take out that thug's knees as consequence of, like, this is what you get when you try and mug people. It's like, this is what justice looks like. It's like, that's not my role. And so Batman is just doing that on a bigger scale, but also appreciating the limitations of what that role means for him in terms of what he can't do in certain situations. Yeah. So all that to say, coming back to kind of the point about the nature of heroism, if you're going to lose something in heroism, you need to lose the violent part. Right? You need to lose the violent part rather than the high character part, if you will. The part that shows this is the good that justice, heroism can achieve. This is what God desires for us. This is what the Bible calls and describes as good. This is the behavior I'm going to put on display. If you have to lose one of those things, lose the violent part. Lose the part that is the avenging angel element of it, because what you are putting on display then, in the kind of the comparison that's coming to my mind is like the soldier who jumps on the grenade for the sake of the life of his friends. Like, you are showing in a sense, kind of the higher ideals and the higher things when you choose the mercy, the good side of the heroism versus just leaning into the restraint and the control side and the restriction side. There's more to be gained by losing that and keeping the good pointing to Christ basically element versus we're going to lose this side of pointing to Christ and we're just going to focus on restraining this evil person and making sure that he feels punishment or whatever.
And to be fair, like, I think a big point of the movie, and I wonder if it was a cultural critique as well, is just the confusion of thinking that heroism is violence, right? The confusion of thinking that heroism is violence. And I think we see that in Joker. But then I think Batman sees that himself as well. Yeah. Like that whole dialogue kind of...
You mean Riddler?
With that. Oh, sorry. Yes, the Riddler. Yeah. But yeah, anyways, that's a really good point. So anything else to add? That's a pretty good place.
No, I think I'll be content to stop there.
Okay, cool. That's a pretty good place to stop then. And thanks again for being
Absolutely.
on. This has been really fun. We'll have to keep doing some more of these.
Yeah, look forward to doing more and look forward to hearing thoughts from people if they have them.
Yeah, for sure. If you have any thoughts on this, feel free to shoot us a Instagram message at Worldview at the Abbey or shoot us an email. Well, that's our show for today. Thanks again for joining. For more information about the Worldview Academy summer camps, go to worldview.org. And for more information about our one-year gap year program for college freshman students, visit worldviewbridgeyear.com. Thanks again for joining us. Hopefully we'll see you soon.